The cloth slipped from her hands and hit the marble floor. The echo broke the silence of the vampire king's study. "Your Majesty," her voice trembled. This boy lived with me in the orphanage." The king turned slowly from his desk, his crimson eyes narrowing. "What did you say?" She pointed at the portrait above the fireplace. A young boy, pale as moonlight, with the same white hair and quiet smile that haunted her dreams. "We slept in the same room," she whispered. "He used to read to the younger children every night. His name was Elias." The king's hand froze midair. Elias, a name he hadn't spoken in 200 years. "That's impossible," he murmured. "My son died at birth." Tears filled her eyes. "No, Your Majesty. He lived. He had your eyes. He always said one day his father would find him." The fire crackled between them, and for a moment the king forgot to breathe. He stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "What else did he tell you?" Her lips trembled. "He said he was waiting for the day he'd be called home." The king's gaze lifted to the portrait again, and a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles one by one. Somewhere deep in the castle, a door creaked open, a door no one had entered in centuries. "Stay with me until the end," because what the king discovered about that boy's true identity would unravel everything the kingdom believed about life and death. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The girl standing before King Lucian Blackthorn was nothing more than a servant, barely 18, with calloused hands and worn clothes that spoke of years spent scrubbing floors and polishing silver. Her name was Mira, and she had been working in the castle for only 3 weeks. 3 weeks of keeping her head down, avoiding eye contact with the nobles, and trying not to think about the memories that clawed at her mind every time she walked these halls. But now, those memories came flooding back with the force of a dam breaking. King Lucian stood 6 feet tall, his presence filling the room like a shadow. His black hair fell to his shoulders, and his pale skin seemed carved from marble. Those crimson eyes that had terrified kingdoms for centuries now held something she had never seen before: vulnerability, pain, something almost human. "Tell me everything," he commanded, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Every detail you remember about this boy." Mira's hands shook as she clasped them together. Where could she even begin? How could she explain to the most feared creature in the realm that his son, the son he believed had died 2 centuries ago, had grown up in a crumbling orphanage on the outskirts of the kingdom? "He arrived at St. Catherine's when I was 7, she began, her voice barely audible. "The nuns said his mother had died giving birth, and no one knew who his father was. But Elias, he was different from the other children." The king's eyes never left her face. "Different how?" "He never got sick. Not once in all the years I knew him. The other children would catch fevers, coughs, all the ailments that come with living in such conditions. But not Elias. And his strength. Your Majesty, I once saw him lift a beam that had fallen from the ceiling. It took 3 grown men to move it back, but he did it alone, and he was only 12 at the time." King Lucian's jaw tightened. These were traits of his bloodline, abilities that only pure-blooded vampires possessed. But if Elias had been alive, why had he never felt his presence? Why had the bond between father and son, the connection that should have drawn them together like magnets, remained silent all these years? "The nuns," he said suddenly. "What did they know?" Mira shook her head. "Very little, or so they claimed. Sister Margaret, the eldest among them, would sometimes watch Elias with this strange look in her eyes, fear mixed with something else. Recognition, perhaps. But whenever any of us children asked about his past, she would change the subject or send us to our chores." The king began pacing, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. 200 years. 200 years of believing his son was dead, of carrying that grief like a stone in his chest. 200 years of ruling with an iron fist, telling himself that love was weakness, that caring for others would only bring pain. Continue, he ordered, though his voice had lost some of its edge. Elias had these dreams, Mira said, her eyes distant as she remembered. Terrible dreams that would wake him screaming in the night. He would talk about a man with red eyes, about a castle made of black stone, about being called home. The other children thought he was mad, but I always believed him. Why? She looked up at the portrait again, at the face that had haunted her thoughts for years. Because he would draw them. His dreams, I mean. He had this gift for art, and he would sketch everything he saw in his sleep. Pages and pages of drawings. A throne room with crimson banners. Hallways lined with ancient portraits. A garden where flowers bloomed only at midnight. King Lucian stopped pacing abruptly. Those were precise details of his castle, rooms and spaces that no outsider had ever seen. His private chambers, his personal gardens, the throne room where he held court. How could a boy living in an orphanage know such things unless the bond was stronger than I thought? He murmured to himself. Your Majesty? He turned to face her fully. These drawings, do they still exist? Mira's face fell. I don't know. When Elias turned 16, he disappeared one night, just vanished without a trace. The nuns searched everywhere, questioned everyone, but it was as if he had simply ceased to exist. I kept some of his drawings hidden in my room, but when I left the orphanage, I had to leave everything behind. The king felt something cold settle in his stomach. If his son had truly been alive all those years, if he had been reaching out through dreams and visions, then where was he now? What had happened to him? How long ago did he disappear? He asked, though he dreaded the answer. 2 years, Your Majesty. It was the night of his 16th birthday. I remember because we had planned a small celebration, just the two of us. We were going to share a piece of bread I had saved from dinner, but when morning came, his bed was empty, and the window was open. King Lucian closed his eyes, trying to process this information. 16. The age when vampire children typically experienced their first transformation, when their powers fully awakened. If Elias had inherited his bloodline, that night would have been crucial. Tell me about that evening, he said. Was there anything unusual? Anything that seemed different about him? Mira thought for a moment. He had been acting strangely for weeks before that, more withdrawn than usual. He would stare out the window for hours, as if he was waiting for something. And his appetite. He had stopped eating almost entirely. The nuns were worried he was falling ill, but he insisted he felt fine. The symptoms she described were classic signs of a young vampire approaching transformation. The loss of appetite, the restlessness, the heightened awareness. But transformation required guidance, a connection to one's bloodline. Without it, the process could be dangerous, even deadly. There's something else, Mira added hesitantly. The night he disappeared, I heard something, a voice calling his name. It wasn't human, Your Majesty. It was something else entirely, something that made my blood run cold. King Lucian's eyes flashed with sudden understanding. If his son had been alive, if the boy had been struggling with his awakening powers, then other creatures might have sensed his presence. Ancient enemies who would see a young, untrained vampire as either a threat to eliminate or a prize to claim. The thought filled him with a rage he hadn't felt in decades. But beneath that rage was something even more powerful. Hope. For the first time in 2 centuries, there was a chance that his son might still be alive. Lost, perhaps. In danger, certainly, but alive. He moved to his desk and pulled out a sheet of parchment, his hand moving swiftly as he wrote. What are you doing, Your Majesty? Mira asked. Summoning my scouts, he replied without looking up. Every village, every town, every forgotten corner of this kingdom will be searched. If my son is out there, I will find him. Mira watched as the king's quill moved across the parchment with urgent precision. Each stroke carried the weight of 2 centuries of grief. And now, the desperate hope of a father who had just learned his greatest loss might not be permanent. But Your Majesty, she said carefully, what if he doesn't want to be found? The king's hand stopped moving. He looked up at her, those crimson eyes burning with an intensity that made her step back. "What do you mean?" "The last conversation I had with him," Mira whispered, her voice barely carrying across the stone chamber. "3 nights before he vanished, Elias told me something that I've never forgotten. He said he could feel something calling to him, something dark and powerful, but he was afraid of it." King Lucian set down his quill and leaned forward. "Afraid of what, exactly?" "He said he could feel hunger growing inside him, not for food, but for something else, something that terrified him." Mira's hands twisted together as she spoke. "He told me he was afraid of what he might become if he answered that call. He said he'd rather disappear than hurt the people he cared about." The king's expression darkened. This was exactly what he had feared. Without proper guidance, without understanding of their nature, young vampires often viewed their awakening as a curse rather than an inheritance. They fought against their instincts, which only made the transformation more violent and unpredictable. "There's more," Mira continued, encouraged by his silence. "Sister Margaret came to see him that final week. I overheard part of their conversation through the dormitory walls. She told him that his father was a monster, that he carried evil blood, and that the only way to save his soul was to resist the darkness at all costs." Rage flashed across the king's features. His hands clenched into fists, and the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Ice began forming on the windows. "She knew," he growled. "The nun knew who he was, and she poisoned his mind against his own heritage." Mira nodded, tears streaming down her face. "She made him believe that becoming like you would make him a demon. That's why he fought it so hard. That's why he was so afraid." King Lucian stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. He moved to the window and stared out at the moonlit courtyard below. For 2 centuries, he had ruled through fear and intimidation. He had cultivated his reputation as a monster, using terror as a tool to maintain order in his kingdom. But now, that very reputation had driven his own son away. "Your Majesty," Mira said softly, "there's something else you need to know about that night." He turned back to her, waiting. "I wasn't entirely truthful before. I didn't just hear a voice calling Elias. I saw who it belonged to." The king's eyes narrowed. "Who?" "A woman, tall, with silver hair that seemed to glow in the moonlight. She wore a cloak that moved like liquid shadow. And her eyes," Mira shuddered. "Her eyes were like starlight, but cold, ancient. She stood beneath his window and called his name 3 times. Each time she spoke, Elias would clutch his chest as if something inside him was responding." King Lucian's blood turned to ice. He knew exactly who she was describing. Seraphina Night Whisper, the Witch Queen of the Northern Territories, his oldest enemy and the one creature in existence who had both the power and the motive to steal his son. "Did you see him go to her willingly?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "No, Your Majesty. That's what was so strange. He fought it. I could see him struggling, as if something was pulling him toward the window against his will. But then suddenly he stopped fighting. His face went blank, empty, and he climbed out the window like he was walking in his sleep. A compulsion spell. Seraphina had used her magic to override his son's free will, to drag him from the orphanage when his natural defenses were weakened by the approaching transformation. The witch had been waiting, watching, biding her time until the moment when Elias would be most vulnerable. "She took him," the king whispered, more to himself than to Mira. "She's had him for 2 years." The implications were staggering. Seraphina was known for her experiments with supernatural creatures, her attempts to harness and corrupt their powers for her own use. If she had possessed a young, untrained vampire for 2 years, there was no telling what she might have done to him. But there was something else, something that made the king's dead heart constrict with fear. Seraphina had once been his lover centuries ago, before their relationship had soured into bitter hatred. She knew his weaknesses, knew exactly how to hurt him in the most devastating way possible. "We have to find him," Mira said urgently. "If she has him, if she's been using her magic on him all this time, he may not even remember who he really is. the king finished grimly. Or worse, she may have turned him against me completely. The thought was almost too painful to bear. To find his son alive only to discover that he had been transformed into an enemy, a weapon to be used against his own father. It would be the ultimate revenge. But King Lucian had not ruled for 600 years by surrendering to despair. He had faced impossible odds before and emerged victorious. This would be no different. He moved to a cabinet in the corner of the room and withdrew an ancient leather tome. The book was bound in scales that shifted color in the firelight, and when he opened it, the pages seemed to whisper secrets in long-dead languages. "What is that?" Mira asked, stepping closer despite her obvious fear. "The Chronicle of Bloodlines," he replied, running his finger down a page covered in intricate symbols. Every vampire family tree, every magical connection, every bond of blood and power that exists in our world. If Seraphina has my son, she cannot completely sever his connection to me. The magic won't allow it. He found what he was looking for and pressed his palm against the page. The symbols began to glow with a soft red light. And suddenly, the king gasped. "I can feel him," he breathed. "Faint, but he's there. The bond still exists." "Where is he?" King Lucian closed his eyes, concentrating on the thin thread of connection that linked his soul to his son's. Images flashed through his mind. A tower made of black glass, chains that gleamed like silver moonlight, a figure slumped in the corner, unnaturally still. "The obsidian spire," he said, opening his eyes. "Seraphina's fortress in the Whispering Mountains. She has him imprisoned there." Mira's face went pale. "The Whispering Mountains. But your majesty, no one who enters those peaks ever returns. The stories say the very air there drives men mad." "The stories are true," the king replied grimly. "But I am not a man, and I will not be stopped by fairy tales and superstition." He closed the tome and moved to another cabinet, this one containing weapons that had not seen use in decades. Ancient swords forged in dragonfire, crossbow bolts tipped with blessed silver, armor that had been worn in battles against gods themselves. "You're going after him," Mira said. It wasn't a question. "I am," he confirmed, buckling on a sword belt. "And you're coming with me." She stared at him in shock. "Your Majesty, I'm just a servant girl. I have no training, no powers, no weapons." "You have something more valuable than any of those things," he interrupted. "You have his trust. If we find him, if he has been changed by Seraphina's magic, you may be the only person he will recognize, the only voice that can reach him." Mira's hands trembled, but she nodded. "When do we leave?" "Now," King Lucian said, fastening his cloak. "Every moment we delay gives Seraphina more time to complete whatever dark purpose she has for my son. And if I know her as well as I think I do, she won't be content to simply hold him prisoner forever." "What do you think she wants with him?" The king paused at the door, his expression grim. "Seraphina has spent centuries trying to find a way to steal vampiric immortality for herself. But the magic is tied to bloodlines, to genetics that cannot be replicated or transferred. Unless what? Unless she has a pure-blooded vampire heir to drain completely. Someone young enough that their power hasn't fully matured, making them easier to manipulate." He met Mira's horrified gaze. "My son isn't just her prisoner. He's the key to making her immortal, Al." The revelation hung between them like a blade ready to fall. King Lucian's crimson eyes burned with centuries of suppressed fury as he contemplated the witch's ultimate betrayal. But beneath that rage, something else stirred. Something he had buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. "Hope, Mira," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Gather your belongings. We leave within the hour." She nodded, but hesitated at the doorway. "Your Majesty, what if we're too late? What if she's already—" "She hasn't." He cut her off with certainty that surprised even him. "I would feel it if he were gone. The bond between father and son transcends even death itself." As Mira hurried from the study, King Lucian moved to the ancient mirror that dominated the far wall. His reflection stared back at him unchanged by the centuries. The same pale skin, the same angular features, the same eyes that had watched kingdoms rise and fall. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, he looked like a father about to wage war for his child. He pressed his hand against the mirror's surface, and the glass rippled like water. Ancient words in the old tongue spilled from his lips, words that hadn't been spoken in this castle for 200 years. The mirror's surface shimmered, and suddenly he was looking not at his reflection, but at a scene playing out in real time. The obsidian spire rose from the whispering mountains like a dagger thrust into the heart of the sky. Its black glass walls reflected nothing, absorbing light and sound until the very air around it seemed to hold its breath. And there, in the tower's highest chamber, he saw him, Elias. The king's breath caught in his throat. His son had grown tall and lean, with the same aristocratic features that marked their bloodline. But something was terribly wrong. The boy sat motionless in the center of a ritual circle, silver chains binding his wrists and ankles. His eyes were open but vacant, staring at nothing, as if his soul had been torn from his body and locked away. Around him, Seraphina moved with predatory grace. The Witch Queen had changed little since their last encounter. Her silver hair still flowed like liquid moonlight, and her ageless face still held that cruel beauty that had once captivated him. But now, watching her circle his son like a vulture, he saw only the monster she had always been. She was chanting, her voice weaving patterns in the air that made reality itself bend and twist. Dark energy poured from her fingertips, wrapping around Elias like invisible chains. With each word she spoke, the boy's life force grew dimmer, his vampire heritage slowly being drained away to feed her insatiable hunger for immortality. "Soon, my dear prince," Seraphina whispered, running a finger along Elias's cheek. "Soon you'll give me everything your father denied me all those centuries ago." King Lucien's hand clenched into a fist, and the mirror cracked down the center. The vision shattered, leaving only his furious reflection staring back at him. But he had seen enough. His son was alive, but barely, and if he didn't act soon, there would be nothing left to save. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor. Mira returned, carrying a small leather satchel and wearing a traveling cloak that dwarfed her small frame. Her face was pale but determined, and in her eyes he saw the same desperate hope that burned in his own chest. "I'm ready, Your Majesty," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "Are you?" he asked, studying her carefully. "Do you understand what we're walking into? The Whispering Mountains are not called that for poetry's sake. The very stones there carry the screams of everyone who has died in those peaks. The air itself will try to drive you mad with visions of your worst fears. Elias is there," she replied simply. "That's all that matters." King Lucien nodded slowly. This small, frightened girl possessed a courage that many of his most seasoned warriors lacked. Perhaps that was why his son had trusted her. Perhaps that was why fate had brought her to him now. "Very well," he said. "But know this. Once we enter Seraphina's domain, there will be no turning back. She will sense our approach long before we reach the spire. She will throw everything she has at us to stop us from reaching him. Then we'd better be prepared," Mira said, surprising him with her steel. The king almost smiled. Almost. Indeed we had. He moved to the final cabinet in the study, one that had remained locked for over 3 centuries. The ancient wood groaned as he opened it, releasing the scent of old magic and forgotten power. Inside, wrapped in black silk, lay artifacts from his earliest days as a vampire lord, weapons and talismans forged in the fires of creation itself. "This was my father's blade," he said, drawing forth a sword that seemed to drink in the light around it. "It has tasted the blood of gods and demons alike. It will cut through Seraphina's magic as easily as flesh." He buckled the weapon to his side, then withdrew a smaller item, a pendant on a silver chain, carved from what looked like crystallized starlight. "And this," he said, holding it out to Mira, is for you." She stared at the pendant in wonder. "What does it do?" "It will protect your mind from the mountain's influence. The whispers that give those peaks their name will try to break your sanity, to fill your thoughts with despair and terror. This will shield you from the worst of it." Mira took the pendant with reverent hands and slipped it over her head. Immediately, she felt a change. The constant low-level anxiety that had plagued her since arriving at the castle faded, replaced by a calm certainty that surprised her. "There's something I need to tell you," she said suddenly. "About Elias. About the last thing he said to me before he disappeared." The king paused in his preparations. "What?" "He told me that if anything ever happened to him, if he ever went missing, I should find you. He said you were the only one who could save him." Tears gathered in her eyes. "He knew this might happen, Your Majesty. Somehow, he knew." King Lucian felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in centuries. His son had thought of him, had trusted him even while believing he was a monster. Even while fighting against his own nature, Elias had known that when the darkness came for him, his father would be there. "He was right," the king said quietly. "I will save him, or I will die trying." They left the castle as the clock struck midnight, moving through the sleeping kingdom like shadows given form. King Lucian had chosen this hour deliberately. His power was strongest when darkness reigned supreme, and they would need every advantage they could get. The journey to the Whispering Mountains would take them through the Thornwood Forest, across the River of Sorrows, and up treacherous paths that had claimed countless lives over the centuries. But the king knew shortcuts, ancient roads that existed between the spaces of reality itself, paths that only creatures of his age and power could safely navigate. "Hold tight to my arm," he instructed Mira as they reached the forest's edge. "Do not let go, no matter what you see or hear. The shadow roads show truth, but not always truths the mind can bear." She gripped his arm with both hands, and suddenly the world around them began to blur and shift. Colors bled together like watercolors in rain, and the solid ground beneath their feet became fluid, uncertain. They were no longer walking through the physical world, but through the spaces between dimensions, where time and distance bent to the will of those powerful enough to command them. Mira gasped as visions flashed around them. She saw the orphanage where she and Elias had grown up, but it was burning, consumed by silver flames that turned everything they touched to ash. She saw Sister Margaret, the stern nun who had filled Elias with such fear of his heritage, standing in a circle of robed figures chanting words in a language that hurt to hear. "It's not real," King Lucian's voice cut through the chaos. "The shadow roads show possibilities, fears, alternate paths. Focus on my voice and nothing else." But even as he spoke, his own visions began to surface. He saw Seraphina as she had been centuries ago, beautiful and terrible, promising him eternity by her side. He saw the moment their love had turned to hatred, when she had demanded he share his vampiric immortality with her, and he had refused. He saw their final battle, the one that had ended with her banishment to the Whispering Mountains, and his oath never to love again. And he saw something else, something that made his dead heart skip a beat. He saw Elias, not as the prisoner in the tower, but as he might have been, grown to full power, ruling justly at his father's side, teaching younger vampires to control their abilities with patience and wisdom, finding love, perhaps even starting a family of his own, all the futures that Seraphina's interference had stolen from them. "Your Majesty," Mira's voice was strained. "I can see him. I can see Elias in these visions." "What do you see?" "He's fighting," she whispered. "Even with those chains on him, even with her magic trying to break his mind, he's still fighting. He's thinking of the orphanage, of the children we used to protect. He's using those memories to stay strong." King Lucian felt a surge of pride so powerful it nearly broke his concentration on maintaining their path through the shadow roads. His son was stronger than either of them had imagined. Even now, faced with a witch whose power rivaled his own, Elias was refusing to surrender. The shadow road began to solidify around them, and suddenly they were standing on solid ground once more. Before them rose the whispering mountains, their peaks shrouded in mist that seemed to move with malevolent purpose, and there, impossibly tall and dark against the star-filled sky, stood the obsidian spire. "We're here," King Lucian said unnecessarily. Mira stared up at the tower, and even with the pendant's protection, she could feel the wrongness radiating from it. This was a place where unnatural things had been done, where the very fabric of reality had been twisted into new and horrible shapes. "Can you feel him?" she asked. The king closed his eyes and reached out with senses that transcended the physical. There, faint but unmistakable, the flickering flame of his son's life force, growing weaker with each passing moment. "He's there," he confirmed. "But we need to move quickly. Seraphina's ritual is nearly complete." They began the treacherous climb toward the spire, following paths that seemed to shift and change when they weren't looking directly at them. The whispers started almost immediately, voices speaking in languages both ancient and alien, promising power, threatening destruction, offering bargains that would damn the soul. Mira pressed closer to the king, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. The pendant around her neck grew warm against her skin, pushing back the worst of the mental assault, but she could still feel the mountain trying to worm its way into her thoughts. "Tell me about him," King Lucian said suddenly. "About Elias as a child. Help me remember what I'm fighting for." So there you have it. A father's love that transcended 2 centuries of grief. A servant girl whose courage matched that of the greatest warriors, and a son whose strength endured even in the darkest captivity. King Lucian and Mira's journey to the obsidian spire would test every bond they held dear, but sometimes the most powerful magic isn't found in ancient spells or mystical artifacts. Sometimes it's found in the simple act of never giving up on the people we love. What do you think happened when they finally reached Elias?